I'll get rid of myself. I'll mute.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Hi, Lara.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm fine. A little bit nervous because I'm like a social phobic person.
You'll be good. It's a great paper. I reread it. It's a really good paper. Okay, I'm going to turn off my video and things until we start.
Okay, see you soon.
If I know how to do that, or it gets too complicated.
Vou pedir para quem puder. Okay, so Professor Rose, if you want to come on camera, we're going to start our sharing in 1, 2, 3. Hi, good to see you again. Bom dia, pessoal. Essa é a nossa última reunião do ano letivo. Não vou falar muita coisa aqui em português hoje, que we have a special guest from Europe to speak to us, so we'll be conducting the meeting in English. It is our final meeting for our PG Year 3 residents training, so it holds very special time, and I'm very happy to bring this theme both for our residents who are graduating and all the other ones. Our theme today is 5E mental health, which Professor Nikolas will explain to you as to what it means. And Professor Nikolas Rose, he is a distinguished honorary professor at the Research School of Social Sciences at the Australian National University, and honorary professor at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the University College of London. He's professor of sociology and founding head of the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College London, and he's a co-founder and co-director of King's ESRSC Center for Society and Mental Health until his retirement in April 2021. He's author of many books, including The Politics of Life Itself, Governing the Soul, The Shaping of the Private Self, Governing the Present, and Our Psychiatric Future, among many others, but these are the ones that have been translated into Portuguese so far. And then for our comments, we're going to have Dr. Laura Andrade, whom I'll introduce after Professor Nikolas's talk. You can take it from there, Professor. I'm going to close our audio from here, and then we can discuss after your presentation, okay?
Okay, can you hear me fine? Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm delighted to be here. I would much prefer to be with you in person, but life and times don't allow that. And what I want to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to outline what I think is a new way of thinking that is beginning to emerge in and around mental health, what I call a new style of thought, which I call 5E mental health. And by this term style of thought, I don't mean a theory, I don't mean a hypothesis, I don't mean a model, I mean something much more general than, like for instance, Kuhn might talk of as a paradigm, a general way of thinking, of framing problems, beginning to understand what questions are important to ask, and so on. So that's what I'm going to try and outline to you today. And if I can manage it, I will share my screen and I will continue to do this. Okay, I hope you can now see my screen. So the talk today is called 5E Mental Health, putting brain, body, and world together again. And it's a rather abstract talk, so I'm delighted that Dr. Laura Andrade is going to give an example of some work that she and her colleagues have done, which, as it happens, chimes very well with this approach. And she'll do that after the talk. So I guess it's important to sort of give an idea of where I'm coming from in doing this talk. Was basically trained as a biologist a long time ago, and I've been very critical, as many have, of the molecular turn in biology, and in particular the molecular turn in biological psychiatry. And so about 20 years ago, I was very impressed by a piece written by the microbiologist Carl Woese called A New Biology for a New Century. And in this piece, he argued that it's time to reject what he called metaphysical reductionism, a style of thought and experiment that stripped the organism from its environment, separated it from its history, from evolutionary flow, shredded it into parts to the extent that a sense of the whole cell, the whole multicellular organism, the biosphere, was effectively gone. And that spoke to me about something which I have felt very much about contemporary molecularization of biomedical psychiatry. And at the time when I was thinking about writing this piece, I was also reading a lot about contemporary cognitive science, in particular the work of Andy Clark and his first big book on this, written in 1997, called Being There, putting brain, body, and world together again. And just this little quote: in place of the intellectual engine cogitating in a realm of detailed inner models, we confront the embodied, embedded agent acting as an equal partner in adaptive responses which draw on the resources of mind, body, and world. So the question is, how might one begin to put brain, mind, body, and world together again in psychiatry? In order to do that, it seems to me, it's necessary to challenge some of the central tenets of what I call the psychiatric complex. What do I mean by that? The psychiatric complex is a set of practices, quite diverse, but nonetheless all led by medically trained practitioners. Practices that center on the clinical encounter between experts and patients. Practices that focus on symptoms which are seen as problems located within individuals in their psychological dynamics or in their neurobiology. An approach which prioritizes diagnosis of the patient's troubles to indicate a course of treatment of an individual, which is usually pharmaceutical or even psychological. And what we have to recognize, and I guess you will know this as being involved in an institute of psychiatry like the one I was very familiar with at King's College London, the clinic is part of a whole psychiatric apparatus. It's surrounded by an industry of research and lavish research funding. It's highly linked to an array of journals, published for profit, of course, but have become integral to the professional careers of those who want to train as psychiatrists. It's linked to an apparatus, still a profitable apparatus, despite all the problems for developing and marketing drugs. And it can live very happily with the growth of other individualized forms of treatment, like talking therapies or CBT. So if one's talking about an emerging style of thought, one is also, it seems to me, talking about whether or not that whole psychiatric complex can be transformed. Does it need to be transformed? Well, what gives me some faith in my argument that something is beginning to crack in that complex is that from very different perspectives, people are beginning to see that psychiatry, as it is currently practiced, has failed. Business as usual has failed and will continue to do so. That was the conclusion of a piece published in The Lancet a couple of years ago by Vikram Patel and colleagues, who argued that a mental health crisis was emerging globally, regardless of each individual's particular resources, and responses to it were impeded by the dominant framing of mental ill health through the prism of diagnostic categories, excessive reliance on independent interventions delivered by specialists, a scarcity of promotive, preventive, and recovery-oriented strategies, etc., etc., etc. And they argued for, centrally, a psychosocial process of intervention, which had at its center people with lived experience. Well, I don't want to go on about their remedies, which I don't fully agree with, but nonetheless, that idea that business as usual has failed, that psychiatry is failing if its practices in the form of individual clinical encounters between an expert and a patient, is also taken up in this nice essay in Daedalus by a psychiatric anthropologist, Helena Hansen, and colleagues about the situation in America. Something's wrong with American psychiatry. It's simply not dealing with the problems of trauma, of drug abuse, of deaths of despair. It's not dealing with the youth mental health crisis. It's not dealing with racial inequities in these patterns. It's not dealing with the numbers of people who are in prison with psychiatric problems. It's not dealing with the fundamental racism in psychiatric practice and so on. We argue, they say, that psychiatry should move away towards sociogenesis of mental health problems through robust collaborations with social movements of oppressed people. My colleague at University College London, James Kirkbride, who's an excellent psychiatric epidemiologist, wrote a paper looking at the psychiatric epidemiology of mental health in relation to social determinants. And he and his colleagues argue, quote, "We need an ambitious but necessary revolution in addressing the mechanisms and pathways through which social inequities are causally implicated in producing poor mental health." So some indication there that there is indeed, in some people's view, a pretty significant crisis in how psychiatry has been conducting its business over the last 20 or 30 years. Of course, the answer for some is to critique the medical model or biomedical psychiatry and argue for a biopsychosocial model. But the biopsychosocial model, or these critiques, have been themselves much criticized. Many psychiatrists we know say psychiatry is kind of committed to the individual clinical encounter. What else can it be? It's a medical profession. Many psychiatrists do take into account the social circumstances, the life histories of patients in understanding the origins and the future of their distress. And the biopsychosocial model is basically a bit of hand waving. It's unscientific, it's vague, it's not precise as to what's important or how. Nonetheless, it seems to me that there are many powerful voices that argue that we must address the foundational social, economic, political drivers of poor mental health. Here's a little quote I like from Laura Sampson and Sandro Galea, that by no means political radicals, but arguing that, quotes, "If we're to extend beyond proximate risk factors to address those foundational social, economic, and political drivers of poor mental health, we must broaden our causal models and learn to apply a social ecological perspective, a focus on exposures that are pervasive, ubiquitous, and hence difficult to study. Examples include social or cultural norms, urbanization, discrimination, political structures, air pollution, poverty, climate change, or migration patterns." Of course, for some, pointing to these foundational drivers can seem like hand-waving. It may seem like arguing that we need to address factors which demand political action, which is way beyond the remit of psychiatry. But what I want to argue in the next half hour is that there are tractable mechanistic pathways which we are beginning to understand, through which social adversity gets under the skin, and there are actionable steps that psychiatrists working with others can undertake today. So let me try and outline what I'm going to argue. And I suppose the first thing that one has to argue if one is beginning to think this way is to go beyond generic references to social determinants, to argue what is the social? What do we mean by social determinants? Now, in psychiatry, the social is usually thought of as the environment, and the environment, especially in psychiatric epidemiology, can be decomposed into factors, provoking factors like domestic stress in childhood, or protective factors or buffers, as they're sometimes called, social capital. So you get this view that environmental factors work on an underlying organic or biological constitution to produce the phenotype, P equals G times E. And you focus on identifying statistically significant population level correlations between factors or variables. But these are really rather gross dimensions: socioeconomic status, population density, ethnic composition, urbanicity. They don't understand what the experience of those things is like by the individuals who suffer those distresses, and they don't understand by which pathways these factors get under the skin. So I think we need to try and do better, and I think we can do better. And that's what I'm going to suggest. Okay, so I call this a 5E approach to mental health, and probably the E's don't work in languages other than English, but nonetheless, they work for me as a handy kind of acronym. And I start from the belief that what Ian Hacking calls mental events, beliefs, emotions, feelings, thoughts, intentions, thinking, reasoning, reflecting, imagining, choosing, deciding, mental events are not just matters of the brain. And here are the 5 E's. They are embodied. They're brought forth not just by the brain, but by the whole living human organism. They are extended. They're not confined by the boundaries of the skin, but they're realized by a human being in interaction with his or her material and interpersonal world. They're emplaced. They always take place in relation to a specific milieu and what it allows or does not allow. Centrally, they are experienced. They are made meaningful by the individual in language, in memory, in salience. And finally, they are enacted. They are actively used in shaping a way of being, a form of life. Embodied, extended, emplaced, experienced, enacted. Those of you who are familiar with 4E cognitive science will recognize some of these terms at least, even if I use them in a slightly different way. So let me say a little bit about each of those terms, and forgive me for this being framed at a slightly abstract level, but I'm delighted that in the commentary that we're going to have afterwards, coincidentally, Dr. Andrade is going to say a little bit about some work that she and her colleagues did, which shows in more detail the kind of things which might be involved in this kind of approach. And I'll also give an example from my own work if I have time. So let's begin with the question of embodiment, the idea that mental events are embodied. They are not just, of course, embodiment has become a very familiar phrase that is used, and those of you who know the kind of work on epidemiology by Nancy Krieger and others will know that she's done a lot of work on embodiment, as of course has feminist social science. So when we're thinking about these mental events, we have to realize that they don't just exist in neural circuits, but what one might call a brain-body environment assemblage. These events include the central nervous system, the gut, the peripheral nerves, the muscles, the skin, input from the sense organs, which is constantly, and this is something which one can learn from contemporary cognitive science, which understands the brain as a kind of prediction machine, constantly interpreting, predicting, inferring, preparing the organism for action in its world. There's a constant millisecond by millisecond dynamic interaction between the brain, the body, and resources in the world, framed around the questions of prediction and action. And this is one of the things where I disagree with some of my colleagues in cognitive science. This is not just a matter of cold, hard cognition, of problem solving. There is no thought without feelings, without desires, and without intentionality. This whole assemblage is infused by feelings, desires, and intentions. And indeed, one can see this when one tries to work with a person in mental distress, because one can see that that entails a change in being, in the whole organism, in the whole sensory motor regime of the person, in the ways in which they experience, move the body, see the world, in their habits and routines of life, in their dress, diet, the management of bodily functions, in their will, desire, their capacity to be in the world. And to some extent, some of this is pointed at in the prevalence of issues of comorbidity, which show that this distinction between mental events and organic events in the body simply doesn't work as a way of thinking how these are embodied in any actual individual experiencing distress. And even the esteemed Journal of Nature a couple of years ago tells us, as if we didn't know, that brain and body are more intertwined than we knew. for neuroscientists, it's time to look beyond the brain. A host of disorders are once thought to be nothing to do with the brain, are in fact tightly coupled to nervous system activity. Okay, first E, embodied. Second E, extended. Here again, one I think can draw on cognitive science to show that these mental events are not demarcated by the boundaries of the individual organism. This is David Chalmers, one of the key thinkers in contemporary cognitive science, talking about cognition, but also about mental states more generally, and also I think about the kinds of things which I was just talking about. This is Chalmers. A subject's cognitive processes and mental states can be partly constituted by entities that are external to the subject in virtue of the subject's sensory motor interaction with those entities. What does that mean? That means that our ways of thinking, our ways of acting are tightly coupled and constrained by features of our milieu, by the network of material and social supports within which we make our lives. Indeed, they are made possible by that, in the same way as the baby's capacity to think and speak and talk is made possible by its relationship with its caregiver, who acts as the human support, the scaffolding to shape and create its mental life. And in thinking like this, I've been influenced not only by 4E cognition and not only by the work of James Gibson on the ideas of affordances in the environment that make it possible for us to think and do things, but also by some great work by the evolutionary psychologist Kim Sterelny and his idea of scaffolding. The design, the configuration of spaces, objects, places, streets, situations, interpersonal actions and practices is scaffolds, constitutes the possibility of us having cognitive abilities, of us having volitional capacities at all. And Celia Hayes, in this very nice book, Cognitive Gadgets, has shown in quite a lot of detail how these ways of thinking that we have, and indeed the very possibility of mind, is tightly coupled to our relationship to other persons and events in the outside world. That's what she calls a cognitive gadget. The theory of mind is a kind of cognitive gadget which the baby develops in its relationship with its caregiver. Okay, so our mental events are extended. They are, and this is the third E, they are emplaced. What does that mean? The human, as any other organism, is always in a place. It's in a space, it's in a milieu, it's in a niche. It never exists outside its place. And its place, over the course of its life, has a fundamental impact on how it develops. We can call those impacts across the life course exposures. And indeed, my colleagues and I have drawn on the work of Christopher Wilde on the idea of the exposome. The exposome, which is a phrase which encompasses all the exposures, social, behavioral, environmental, experienced over a lifetime, aims to provide a complete picture of health-related exposures occurring both in and outside the body. The body is always emplaced and it's always exposed. And here I've got the rather well often quoted diagram that Christopher Wilde developed in his earlier work, which tries to differentiate between three types of exposures: internal exposures to metabolism, hormones, body morphology, gut microflora, etc. External, specific external exposures like radiation, infectious agents, pollutants, tobacco, alcohol, and so on, and general external exposures, which he thinks are the proper domain of the social sciences. But the proper domain of the social sciences also includes these kinds of pollutions: noise, food and water, air quality, and so on. And also social space, violence, social exclusion, racism, isolation, and loneliness. So the body is in place, the human is in place, and the human is exposed. And in understanding those mental events of which I talked about, one also needs to understand the nature of those exposures, either both at any one time and also across the life course. So that is perhaps my third E. Just how much time? As I said at the beginning, one of the things about the biopsychosocial approach, one of the many criticisms of it, was that it couldn't identify the kind of pathways through which these exposures got under the skin. But I think we are now beginning, at least in outline, to have some ways of thinking about these exposures, thinking about the ways in which mechanistic pathways can shunt what's outside into the inside of the body and the brain. The first one of those will be well familiar to all of you, which is the argument from epigenetics. The second will also be familiar to all of you, the argument about neurogenesis and the capacity of the brain to generate and incorporate new neurons is shaped by everything from diet to exercise to stress. The third is indeed stress. The stress, a highly ambiguous concept, but nonetheless, one of the key ways in which one can begin to think about those relays between the outside and the inside, the way in which being exposed to stressful circumstances, to what you perceive as a stressful circumstance, not an objective social circumstance, but an experienced social circumstance, modifies neural circuits, produces functional change in the hypothalamus, activates the immune system, produces cytokines, and produces genetic changes via epigenetics and neurogenetics. And here's a kind of rather classical little diagram showing how those how stress works and how those repeated exposures to stress may shape the internal biological and neurobiological characteristics of the individual. And we also have the microbiome. Of course, there's a lot of pop science about the microbiome and how one's gut flora affects one's mental health. But there are at least some plausible biological pathways through which one can think about microbiomes shaping and inflammation as well, shaping mental health. So here at least one sees the beginnings of some tractable neurobiological pathways through which exposures get under the skin. Central to this account, though, is something a little bit more. And it's something a little bit more which requires us to say something very obvious about human beings, perhaps about other animals too, which is that human beings live in a world of experience. Human beings are constantly making sense of their world and making sense of themselves in it, taking actions and taking decisions and shaping their life course in relation to that sense of the world and how it is meaningful for them. Something that is very well embodied in a French word, vécu, life as it is lived, for which there is no English equivalent, I suppose lived experience being the most obvious English equivalent. How life as it is lived, I don't know what the Spanish or Portuguese is for vécu, but maybe, I hope, there is a more appropriate word than lived experience. What about this lived experience? The environment, going back to my earlier slide, the environment is not merely a set of kind of objective variables like ethnic density, socioeconomic status. The environment is saturated with salience, shaped by meanings, populated with memories, associated with dread, with fear, with trauma, with delight, with hopes and expectations. And here again, there are ways in which one can elicit an individual's experience of their environment. With some colleagues at University College, we're making use of the idea of experiential maps as they were developed by Stan Milgram, whose work is most commonly associated with the idea, with his work on obedience, but he also did this really interesting work on psychological maps of Paris and psychological maps of New York. informed by that great book by Kevin Lynch called The Image of the City, because people do not live in a city which is mapped out by GPS coordinates. As they walk through the city, they walk through a world which is shaped by their meanings, their experiences, and their memories. And you can actually elicit those meanings, experiences, and memories. This is what Stan Milgram did with his colleagues. He took individuals along a walk, along their walk to work, or their walk to home, or their walk in the park. And then after that walk, he asked them to draw that walk, as they did here, and to populate that walk with things that they had experienced and were feeling along the ways in which they were walking. Memories of being in a particular house, memories of having been experienced violence in a particular street corner, memories of having fallen in love in a particular path. These sensory affective maps that we all carry as we walk around the world that we inhabit. So the world is experienced and the world is enacted. Animals, as I go back right to the beginning to my reference to cognitive science and the idea of prediction machines, animals, embodied animals of which humans are one of them, are constantly predicting and enacting their lives, constantly making decisions about the way they're going to do things in the niches that they inhabit. And in order to understand their lives, we need to understand how they are actively enacted and not simply passively experienced. And as we'll see, I think if I'm right in the next commentary, we can see that if you do this work with people experiencing mental distress, you can see that they have many everyday acts that are either promote mental health or are inimical to mental health, acts that support resilience or acts that provoke hypervigilance, strategies of coping in informal relations, in mutuality, in recognition with other neighbors, perhaps in religious solace and others. And what this means is that to understand all those other E's that I've talked about, we need to listen to the voice of individuals, of actual or potential patients, not as decontextualized individuals in a clinic, but in the context of their lives with many others who are also experiencing adversity, mental distress, and psychiatric treatment. We know that for a long time, those who had experienced mental distress were subject to what is now frequently called epistemological injustice. That is to say, they were not understood as credible knowers. But my belief is that those people who've experienced mental distress and those people who've experienced life in adversity are indeed credible knowers. They can articulate and help us ground an understanding of distress, of common and severe mental distress, and of strategies for mitigating it. And they can provide us with an alternative, an additional source of knowledge for how people actually enact their lives in situations of adversity. Some of this, not all of it, but some of it is developed in these books on inactive psychiatry, like the excellent book by Sanaka Dahan, who I've just put the picture up here. But some of this is also understood in the movements of mental health users themselves and their development of alternative knowledges of their forms of distress. Of course, these problems exist in the medium of time, and we need to understand across the life course the cumulative consequences of psychiatric medication, of stress, of poor diet, poor housing, social stigma, harm, etc., which tells us that some conditions aren't inherently degenerative. They degenerate because of those cumulative consequences. And here one can draw from Bruce McEwen's excellent work on allostatic load, or Geronimus's work on weathering. Why does one need to look at these trajectories? Because one needs to identify the places and possibilities where one can intervene in order to change those trajectories. And I think one can do that by integrating these biological and neurobiological insights with some older sociological questions about inequality, poverty, exclusion, racism, and violence. And I think this helps us realize that it's not that these changes have to happen at a large scale, requiring changes in political and economic policies. Small changes can affect the reality of people's lives in the small-scale worlds in which they live. But this requires us to go beyond, to transcend the individualism of psychiatry and its focus on the individual clinical encounter. As was mentioned in the beginning, I used to be head of a department which we called Global Health and Social Medicine. And this approach, which I'm advocating, is not a particularly new one or a radical one. It's an approach grounded in social medicine, grounded in understanding of what social anthropologists have termed social suffering, what Paul Farmer, who was the head of the Harvard Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, which our King's department to some extent modeled itself on, what Paul Farmer referred to as the causal role of structural violence. Mental distress, they argued, and I agree, arises from the actual social and material experiences of individuals as they make their lives enmeshed by others, with others in the places they live in their biopsychosocial niches, as we rather awkwardly called it in a paper I recently worked. They make their lives in these small-scale worlds that are kind of effaced in correlational styles of thought in epidemiology. And we need to understand how these multiple pathogenic exposures get under the skin and afflict body and soul across time. And in order to do that, we need to listen to the voices of those who experience distress about what they find pathological and about what they believe can be potentially helpful, their everyday experiences of resilience and support. And if we do that, I think we can identify and act with others to identify and intensify those tractable pathways. When I say we, I mean social scientists, I mean community workers, I mean architects, I mean planners, but I also mean psychiatrists. And this means psychiatrists getting out of the clinic and getting into the everyday worlds in which their clients live, and to understand and help us all act on those worlds. In other words, it needs all psychiatrists to become kind of social activist psychiatrists, activists not in a radical political way, although that would be great, wouldn't it? But activists in the sense that they realize and help us seek to change the tractable pathways through which mental ill health develops. This requires us, as is evident from what I've said, to have a reconfiguration of that psychiatric complex, to transform the way in which we fund research out of the laboratory into interdisciplinary investigations which explore these kinds of issues, to link the voice and experience and knowledge of individuals to these mechanistic pathways, which I've talked about, and to develop new roles for mental health professionals, new strategies of training, new collaborations with other professions, new ways of practicing, quotes, in the wild, and not only in the individual clinical encounter. I can say a little bit about this in question and discussion time, but I'm not going to talk about this now. But I think that may seem a rather abstract presentation, but it is possible to make these kinds of arguments empirical. And that's what I'm doing with a small group of people, colleagues at University College London, to look at the mental health of young women in a small area of North London called Islington, where we have an interdisciplinary team of sociologists, anthropologists, psychiatric epidemiologists, looking particularly at the experience of and perceptions of violence, mapping what we call pathogenic niches, the niches within which these kinds of adverse environments are intensified across urban space, linking those experiential studies and ethnographic studies with quantitative studies about noise pollution, about crime, about overcrowding, about poverty, understanding how those places are experienced by using the kind of mapping technologies, experiential mapping that I mentioned earlier on, with the aim to identify tractable points where one can intervene. And here we're working with non-governmental organizations, with the local authority on policies and priorities to address exposures at the population level. In the same way, I suppose, as in the very successful campaigns about smoking-related cancer, which worked at a whole series of levels to address not the biomedical pathways of cancer itself, but all those conditions which gave rise to cancer. We're working with architects, we're working with planners, we're trying to support some local scaffolds for good mental health, and so on and so forth. I can say a little bit more about this, but I know perhaps some of these issues will come up in comments and discussions. So 5E is an emerging paradigm shift. Many psychiatrists are aware of these systematic and structural forces. Some psychiatrists are making steps to challenge them, but I don't underplay the fact that psychiatrists themselves are working in what one might call cramped spaces. They are trained to work in the clinical encounter with the individual patient, and moving outside that clinical encounter is difficult for them. And I think if this 5E approach is to be realized, we need to kind of transform the education, the practices, the forms of reward, the forms of priority in how psychiatry actually exists. What psychiatry exists, transform that psychiatric complex to have a paradigm shift in how psychiatry is taught and practiced and researched. A paradigm shift, well, Thomas Kuhn recognized that the moves towards paradigm shifts are always resisted precisely because they identify real problems with normal science. But I think, as I tried to show at the beginning, many are beginning to recognize that at a population level, psychiatry as it is currently thought and practiced is failing, has failed, and will continue to fail despite the best efforts of very well-meaning and intelligent and thoughtful and skilled persons in their individual encounters. It will never be sufficient to transform mental health at a population level. Nonetheless, the time before a paradigm shift is replete with dangers, and making these shifts will by no means be easy. And I think I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Rose. I think you had to deal with a little bit of a silent clapping there, but
I did, yeah.
we got there. Let me just see if I can move this. Yes. Okay. Now for the comments, I'm going to call Professor Dr. Laura Andrade, who's an MD, PhD at our Institute of Psychiatry. She is a psychiatrist who graduated at the University of São Paulo, had her postdoctoral training from the Department of Mental Health at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, School of Public Health. She's the coordinator of the Psychiatric Epidemiology Research Center at our institute, where she leads the São Paulo Megacity project, among other projects. And her main areas of expertise are research in psychiatric epidemiology, psychiatric diagnosis, social psychiatry, and since 2019, she's been listed as one of the world's most influential researchers according to the updated science-wide author databases of standardized citation indicators. With both of you, we had to shorten your resumes, your CVs a lot, so I hope that Laura will speak for herself and bridge the gap between the social perspective that you brought us and how psychiatry can implement that.
Como é que funciona? Posso tirar aqui? Sim. Precisa de...
Não, não precisa, pode pegar.
Tá.
Você não quer saber?
Não. Okay, I am here with a difficult task that is comment on Professor Nikolas Rose's brilliant lecture, where he presents an ambitious proposal for a paradigm shift. This is very important for us. There are most of us that we are clinicians, and I will talk as a clinical psychiatrist that I am. And I move to epidemiology to understand the psychopathological manifestations and social determinants of what we call now psychiatric disorders. And I was faced with a major questions when I published data from my research, the São Paulo Megacity project. I followed classical epidemiology, getting context variables to expand the possibilities of analyzing the impact of the environment, risk factors in mental health. One of the results that drew the most attention was the greater chance of women who grew up and remain in areas of the city with high social deprivation to have major depression, when compared to those who grew up and live in areas with low social deprivation. And how can we explain the high prevalence rates found, especially of depression in those women living in the private areas in the richest city in Brazil? That was the questions of many journalists when I released the results. And they ask you, why these figures? And even more difficult to answer, what can be done to alleviate the suffering of these women? Those were hard questions that only could be answered if we change our way of seeing these kind of problems. If you go there to the niche as Nikolas is suggesting. And so what kind of research we need to fill this gap? It was only when I started working with Nikolas Rose in two research projects, FAcSS King's College projects, that started in 2017, that I was able to see close the reality of the living conditions of people living in the outskirts of São Paulo and understand the complexity, what we call social. At the beginning of the research, health professionals from the Brazilian National Health Services and from various human rights and social service organizations who work hard directly with the population reported that they feel unable to cope with the psychological suffering that these conditions impose to the residents. I heard this, Suas, that is the National Health Service, the Brazilian National Health Service, professionals crying at a public hearing, feeling wronged by the demands made by human rights activists. We do everything we can, they said, and they really do everything. This was was the feeling of the human rights professionals also, with whom we continue to work, a feeling of helplessness with these kind of problems. During the pandemic, at the beginning of the lockdown, our research team could not distance ourselves from the population of the territory, one of the districts of São Paulo with the highest number of deaths from COVID. The district in which this research was implemented has a population of near 300,000 inhabitants, most of them self-declared Black or Pardo. And a fifth of this population lives below the poverty line. And most of them live in favelas, in small houses with very crowded people sharing the same rooms. Now around 30% of households do not have running water or sewage. The percentage of informal works with uncertain jobs in the regions is also high. So inspired by, we are in the middle of the COVID, so we couldn't go to the community. We have to do something online. So I was inspired by a project that was implemented in a poor neighborhood in the city of Baltimore, in partnership with Johns Hopkins University, in response to the COVID pandemic. So our research team, with the help of members of the Human Rights Center, we create a community-based project to help people strengthen bonds of solidarity and emotional support during the pandemic. This was made through supportive telephone calls to the community counterparts, offering empathic listening. So the Human Rights Center and other local social assistance organizations appointed key people of the community, like leaders in the community, that volunteers to make phone calls to neighbors, residents, and services as intermediaries between the research team and the neighborhood residents. So our idea was to create a solidarity network that could help to promote social and emotional support among the community members. The community leaders make phone calls to local residents, and were able to explore through first-person accounts how they organize their lives to face one of the greatest health and humanitarian crises in recent times, in an urban context that was already extremely adverse. We were able to investigate the perspective of local residents on how social conditions and urban insecurities under which people live are experienced in terms of subjective suffering and how they deal with them. So we identified two important dimensions to discuss the nature of the suffering and distress. One dimension refers to the lived urban experience characterized by various insecurities as financial, housing, food, the local dynamic of conviviality in the neighborhoods, situations that directly impact the emotional states and suffering experienced by the territory's residents. The second dimension is related to the context of vulnerability and uncertainty, marked by a lack of social protection of the state. To fill this gap, it's needed that civil society organizations and different forms of legal agency rise to tackle problems posed by human exclusion and the suffering experienced by the local population. On the top of the economic and financial insecurities, other everyday aspects of social life in the outskirts of the city also shapes the urban experience, and we residents of São Paulo, we know this much better. Urban insecurity, domestic violence, drug trafficking, policy action, among many other situations of conflicts, are often described as part of the daily life of residents of the outskirts of the city. These situations are broadly present in the territory and appears in the volunteer reports in a vivid way. The volunteers, they often highlight the importance of community belonging and solidarity practices for caring for the psychological suffering of their counterparts. So they organize themselves to give support in the community, not go into the services or asking someone. They go. They highlight the importance of peer recognition and the relevance of community articulation for mutual care. Residents of the neighborhood frequently resort to the local association, either in the neighborhood, the churches, and political collectives. Nonetheless, urban mental health studies frequently underestimate the potential of this strategy addressing detrimental structural problems. So I believe that we have to be connected with this network of support when we work there. So this is a kind of a research that's named participatory action research. So we have a lot of actors acting together. Now, for instance, persons from the community, other professionals. In this participatory methodology, allow us to identify subjective aspects of lived experience that are harder to address by quantitative research frameworks. I believe that qualitative research involving several authors, as Rose proposed, can be a starting point for actions in a given niche, and that this can be a paradigm shift, I think, as important as the closure of the asylum, as he mentioned in his paper. So it's time for us to understand the limits of clinical encounters in alleviating the mental distress of most of the population. Perhaps we can, as psychiatrists and mental health professionals, go beyond the office, interacting with the community to find new ways to improve people's life. So that's my...
Pode sentar lá, Laura, que a gente abre para discussão. Pode sentar ali com... Thank you so much, Laura. We'll now open for questions and comments. I'll try and manage the camera in a way where you can see the person who's asking the question. But mostly I'll move the microphone around, okay? If you want to say anything back to what Dr. Laura said, please feel free, Professor.
Can I just say, thank Lara.
Of course.
Fantastic, fantastic illustration of the kinds of things that I've been trying to advocate. And couldn't be clearer, really. And I really urge people to read the paper describing this research, because it's both exemplary, and it's exemplary in its methods and its conclusions, and it really shows that the idea of a paradigm shift, as fundamental as the closure of the asylums, is not just a fantasy. However difficult it can be realized. And I think the work that Lara and her team have done is a terrific example of that. And I'm very glad to say we are collaborating. The group I'm with at University College London is collaborating with the group at the University of São Paulo to develop these approaches further, and also with people in Porto to develop these approaches further in 3 very different urban environments. So thank you.
I thank you very much for all that I learned with you. And I said in a meeting that you changed my life when I met you, because I have all these questions about the results of this epidemiological study that we did carefully and with all the methods, but we could not answer most of the questions with this quantitative data. And also I want here to tell that most of the work is done by a incredible team of young researchers. So Felipe Shabson, Paula Albertini, Daniela Ravelli, Leonora Brum, you, Cristobal Abarca. They are incredible people that help us to do all this work, and I didn't mention their name. So we are going to follow this kind of research further, and I'm looking forward to our work in this frame that you show us today.
Like I said, camera was going to be tricky. But sorry. I guess I have two questions, Professor Rose. One would be, how do you see the relationship between these 5 E's that you mentioned? Is this, how would you describe them, right? Because what would be the point of us studying and going through all of them and each of their roles if there would be a linear causal relationship between, let's say, environment or the exposome and then behavior? You know what I mean? Like, what would be the point of studying embodiment if that's just something that happens simultaneously with all of those levels, and the linear causal connection could be simpler than that, unless you think there is a mediating relationship between these different levels and the ways they interact. And the second question is, how do you see the need for a psychiatrist if we are to leave the psychiatric setting? The very basis over which the specialty is built presupposes, right, a clinical encounter and the individual in the medical care. When we leave the clinical setting and we're acting in social settings, would there be a need for a medical doctor, a psychiatrist to do that? Shouldn't we be thinking about other people to perform these interventions and study these aspects?
Okay, 2 very good questions. Let me see if I can help. What's the relationship between the 5 E's? So at the very beginning, I said this 5 E approach was not a theory, it was not a hypothesis, it was not a model, it was a style of thought. Okay, a style of thought. And I think Dr. Andrade has given us a very good example of how one might begin to do that in practice, which is not really to start from creating some experimental, quasi-experimental situation, looking at the different contributions of all these different dimensions, but it's to start from the reality of the lived experience of people's lives in adversity and try and explore the ways in which at any individual time and across their life course, these kinds of dimensions have interacted. For instance, to give you an example, from the pilot work that we have done in Islington in North London, which is about young women's experience of or fear of violence. Perhaps the most simple thing that comes out of this is that young women walking the streets of North Islington live in a state of hypervigilance. They are hypervigilant across more or less all the time in which they are outside their house, in fear of attack, in fear of being insulted, in fear of being called names. They see the world as a very, very hostile place. They are exposed to actual violence. They're exposed to noise. They're exposed to filthy streets. They're exposed to darkness as they walk under bridges. They have been exposed to these over a long period of time. One can begin to bring together, by listening to the way in which they enact their lives in these circumstances and the little tactics and strategies in which they use to mitigate this experience, one can begin to understand how people live their lives in these situations of adversity and how the hypervigilance might shape their mental distress. And one can correlate this with the use of psychiatric drugs, for instance. We're looking at the use of the GP practices prescribing psychiatric drugs. So one can begin to do this, but one needs perhaps to start from the lived experience of the individuals and groups in those circumstances and see how these different dimensions shape and affect their lives. Now, what is the role of the psychiatrist? So I would think a number of roles. First of all, you have sitting one row in front of you, one of the world's leading epidemiological psychiatrists in the shape of your very own Dr. Andrade, who has shown you what her role can be in running a big research team, in thinking about the way to do this research, in carrying out this research, and bringing to her understanding of the situation of those people living in adversity everything that she's learned through her clinical training and practice as to how these experiences might shape people's health. So psychiatrists understand how adverse experiences shape mental health. It doesn't necessarily mean that the obverse of that is the only intervention that they can make is working with that individual. Although there may well be cases in which they will work with individuals, but there are also all sorts of other ways, as that example so vividly showed, in which psychiatrists can work with other mental health professionals and with other non-mental health professionals to transform the living experience of those people in adversity in a way that they could probably never do, especially with those people in Sapopemba, never do through individual clinical encounters. I don't deny, and of course, secondly, psychiatric research and psychiatric neurobiological research has helped us understand the ways in which some of these pathways work, the ways in which hypervigilance and stress might shape neurogenesis, might shape all those things that we know about stress responses. So psychiatric research, psychiatric medical and biomedical research is not somehow sidelined by this. It can help us understand precisely those pathways in which those lived experiences get under the skin. And that, I think, is really important in understanding where one might intervene in order to transform them. There is one way of thinking about all this. I just mentioned this since I'm talking, which maybe many people are familiar with, which says that the most important period of life is the first 1,000 days. Okay, and which focuses on adverse experiences in the first 1,000 days and how they program mental health and cognitive development across the life course. And I understand that, and often some of that is quite radical and argues for increased resources for poor families, for poor caregivers, for children living in adversity. But we also have to realize that the way in which this is played out is in the everyday reality of people's lives in a place and a time and a situation. And that's the kind of work which the participant action research that Laura talked about and that we are trying to do is focused upon. So it means that, yes, it probably does mean a change in psychiatry and in psychiatrists' role, as I say in the paper, and as Laura said, as profound as the change giving up the asylum, as profound perhaps as the change in losing faith in psychiatric medication as the only intervention, as profound a change as the ones we have experienced between the 1950s over the last 50 years. And maybe that's too difficult to contemplate, but I do think it's the fact, as I started with, the fact that psychiatrists themselves are beginning to recognize that their individualized practice cannot deal with the scope of the problems which are being presented to them in these mental health crises, cannot deal with them, does perhaps suggest that another approach is kind of necessary.
Thank you very much.
Professor Rose, my name is Eurípides Miguel. I'm the chair here of the Department of Psychiatry. On the right, Orestes Forlenza is the vice chair. We appreciate a lot the opportunity of having you here giving a talk. Orestes, say hello. We are very happy. I appreciate the possibility to have you here. And I could have a glance how much we can learn with you. And this encounter made me a little perturbing because I need to make my models, my conceptual models in education and in research and seeing patients a little wider. And so so I'm inspired by you to reflect about this new paradigm. So thank you very much. And Laura, we will be very happy to support a visit of Professor Rose. If you guys want to organize, we will do our best to support your visit. So please consider that possibility.
Thank you very much. I've come a few times in the earlier work that I was doing with Laura's team, come a few times to São Paulo. It's always great to be there and great to be with the team. Unfortunately, age and so on make traveling a little bit more difficult these days than it used to be. But if I could manage it, I would be absolutely delighted. And I just kind of want to echo what Laura said about the young researchers, some of whom I got to know when I was over here. As I think has been evident, we've been kind of working together for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years in different ways since we encountered over some, because I knew Laura's work from the Megacities study, and she came over to London to some work we were doing on urban mental health, to a workshop they were having, and that was the beginning of a long and very productive relationship. And I came over several times, and some of the students from São Paulo have also been in my old department at King's College London. So it's a great relationship, and let's hope we can build on it. And if I can come before age and infirmity makes travel completely impossible, I'd be absolutely delighted to come and see you in person. Zoom is good, but it's no substitute to sitting with you and over a cup of coffee and having a chat about these things.
Please, we'll be also delighted. Thank you very much.
So let's organize that.
Thank you so much, Professor Rose. I know you're low-key out of your retirement for this talk. And yeah, I really, really appreciate it. And books do not get signed over Zoom, so we do need to get you here in person. And hopefully more Portuguese translations of your books as well. Your most recent ones would be great.
Okay. And can I also just say, I don't know if I sent you a copy of the paper, the paper from this talk. I know Lara has a copy. I'm very happy for it to be circulated. At some point in the indeterminate future, it will come out in transcultural psychiatry. So it's in a little bit more depth there, but yeah, good. I'd love to come and sign some books for you. And thanks to my Portuguese translators as well. Maybe I'll learn some Portuguese.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. See you.
Thank you. Nice to see you all. Nice to see you, Lara. Hope to see you again soon.